Welcome everybody to NorCal Slot Car Scene. I've been tied up with the video on the NSR Lola in the last couple of days, so I put the Corvette C8 on the back burner, but now that the Lola is almost done, I've got time to work on the Corvette C8. In this video, we'll go over the parts that you need to build the car, the tires that you need, which the tires are the most important part of any slot car, and then we'll talk about the track record racing setup that I used at Fast Track Hobbies to set the all-time track record for any class of cars. Before we do, let's take a look at the previous C8 that I built. I used a white chassis because that's kind of the norm, and a little bit of ballast that you can see there. The first time out, the car was very fast and did set a track record for the class. However, I didn't get the win, and that was more driver than anything else. The next time out at Motown, set the fastest GT3 lap of the race and won the event. At High Sierra Speedway, I was able to get another win, and one of my fellow racers decided he wanted to buy the Corvette, so I sold it to him. Obviously, it was time to build a new car, so I went down to my local hobby shop and bought a Corvette C8 white kit. Okay, we're ready to start the build, so let's talk about the parts we're going to use for the Corvette C8. I'm going to change this car a little bit from the previous C8 because of some things I've learned and some things I want to try. We're going to keep the stock chassis and the stock motor pod. The previous C8 used a hard chassis, but I'm going to try the standard black chassis on this car to see how it works. We retain the motor and the pinion gear. We have to run the 21,400 RPM angle winder motor in the NorCal rules, so that's going to be retained. I'm going to keep the stock pinion gear on this car and then adjust the spur gear to the various track conditions. We're going to use the stock axles. In the NorCal rules, we're required to use steel non-hollow axles. If I had the choice, I would definitely go to the hollow axles for this. Now let's take a look at some of the option parts we're going to add to the car to make it into a competitive race car for NorCal GT3 racing. Here's the parts we're going to change, and we'll go through them one by one. Because we're running on wood tracks, I'm going to use the NSR 4859 guide. We have an NSR race later in the year that will require NSR parts only, so that's why I'm using the NSR guide. You could also use other brands like Slot Invasion or Slotting Plus. I really like the NSR copper braid. It's extremely thin and flexible, and I use this braid on all of my race cars. Our rules do allow you to change the front wheels and tires, so we're going to change out to the 16x8 front aluminum wheels, which are a little bit smaller in diameter than stock, and when we replace the rears with a 16mm, I think it just looks a little bit better. If your rules allow, you might try the NSR plastic lightweight front wheels, but I think in the race that we're going to have, that probably won't be allowed, so I'm just going to use the aluminum wheels on the front. I'm also going to use the cosmetic wheel inserts from the Ford P68 classic car, just because I like the looks of 5-spoke wheels on my GT cars. The previous build used a 12-tooth pinion, so I'm undecided right now whether they're going to change the stock 13-tooth pinion with this 12-tooth pinion, but both of these pinions are the NSR angle winder style pinions. I'm also going to use the Slotting Plus axle stoppers. These go on the axle and make it much easier when you're changing tires because you don't have to readjust the lateral side play of the axle every time you take the tires on and off. So this just makes things a lot easier. To stiffen up the rear end, which really makes the car handle better, we're going to use the Slotting Plus Combi Plus bushings. It's a one-piece bushing stiffener that just snaps right into the motor pod. You can make these on your own, but this just makes a much cleaner installation in my opinion. Finally, we're going to use the Slotting Plus mini stainless steel spacers. But basically, these go into the chassis, and they're held in place by the set screws that determine the front ride height. What this does is actually creates a bushing-like effect and removes all the slop in the front axle and makes the front axle much more precise. So that's the option parts, as well as the stock parts we're going to keep. So let's go on and show you the build process. Now let's take a look at the most important part of this build, or any slot car for that matter, and that's the rear tires and wheels. We'll start with the wheels. For almost all the cars I use on the wood tracks in Northern California, I start with the NSR 5018 wheel. It's a lightened air wheel. The difference between this wheel and the standard wheel is that the rib that forms the air channel is slightly smaller in diameter. and that seems to give the tire more compliance, and the tire just works better. Another important part of the build of the rear wheels and tires are the inserts. I use the MR Slot Car 9551 inserts, and they're typically trued to 16 millimeters after they're glued to the wheels. I do use rubber cement to glue these to the wheels, and if you try to true them without gluing them, they'll expand and you won't get a precise cut. As for the theory of inserts, in my opinion, it's kind of like pumping up the air on a tire. Because we're using air wheels, there's a cavity or an air channel inside, and the foam inserts actually act as air inside the wheel. If you've ever ridden a bicycle with underinflated tires, you know what I mean. With underinflated tires, the tires will grip very well, but they just won't roll. And we need a tire that rolls and gives grip to produce a fast slot car. The final part of the equation, obviously the most important, are the actual tires themselves. I have 4 go-to compounds of tires that I use on almost all the cars. First being the slotted G25, which technically is designed for plastic tracks, but it works great on wood tracks. The NSR Ultra Grip, and the NSR Super Grip. And along with a new one I've tried recently, the Racer Sideways 28 Shore. When you look at these 4 tire compounds from more grip to less grip, you start with the G25. It definitely has the most grip, down through the less grip with the Racer Sideways tires. Now you ask, why would I want a tire with less grip? Well, it's all about rolling resistance. Again, back to the bicycle. If you've got a tire that has too much grip, whether it's under inflation or too much actual traction with the tire compound, it will just not roll around corners and you'll lose corner speed. So there's no magic right answer here. You have to match the tire to the track you're running on. When I go to a home track, I typically use the slotted G25 or the NSR Ultra Grips. They have the most grip of the 4 tires that we're looking at here. And on a low bite track, like a typical home track, this is what you need. When I go to a track like Motown or Fast Tracks where the grip is ultra high, then I go to the other tires, either the NSR Super Grips or the new Racer Sideways tires. These 2 compounds have the least amount of grip. When you go to a track that has ultra high grip, you're actually looking for less grip in the tire to match the surface of the track and get good corner speed along with good forward bite. And that's what I find when I go to the track. If the Sideways tires don't have enough forward bite, then I'll go a little bit softer to the Super Grips. And that gives me the forward bite I'm looking for as well as the corner speed. So again, it's all about matching the tire to the track to get the ultimate lap time out of these race cars. The heart of the car is building the motor pod, the motor, and the rear axle assembly. Here you can see we've installed the motor and snapped the combi axle bushing in place. When you install the motor, make sure you use 2 screws, one in the back and one in the front. This helps lock the motor in place. These long can angle winders have so much torque, they have to be solidly in place or it will definitely affect the handling. To help that, in the back, we're going to use silicone adhesive and run a bead right along the back side of the motor to glue it to the pod. You see here the combi axle bushing, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use silicone adhesive to lock the combi axle bushing in place. Locking these 3 pieces together, the motor pod, the motor, and the bushing, helps to make these long can angle winders handle extremely well. Next up is the gearing. I'm going to use the stock gearing on this car, but there's a couple other options that you can use. On the left is the Slotting Plus gear, and on the right is the MR Slot Car gear. These are both sidewinder gears, but if you choose the correct diameter, 16.5 for this car, they'll mesh perfectly. Now it's time to put everything together on the rear axle. You notice on the left is the stopper, and next to the stopper, I've put 2 5,000 spacers on both sides. You have to do this so that the axle stopper or the bushings don't rub against the axle tube. It also acts as a kind of a bushing in itself, so I always put 2 5,000 spacers on either side of any car with bushings. Next to that, there's a 2 millimeter spacer from NSR, which sets the gear mesh. And then finally the gear goes on. And obviously everything slides together. If the gear mesh is not tight enough and you've got too much backlash, you can add a third 5,000 spacer on the right side. This will push the gear a little bit further away from the bushing and into the gear and tighten up the gear mesh. Here's the whole assembly ready to go. When I attach the chassis to the pod, I'm looking for the least amount of play possible. I tighten the pod so there's no movement and then progressively back the screw off so I get the pod in the chassis with the least amount of play, but it still moves freely. Once that's done, I typically use a piece of strapping tape across the pod and the chassis to tie everything together. At the track, I'll try with and without the tape to see what works the best. On the front end, we're going to use those 4mm spacers from Slotting Plus. They simply slide onto the axle and then slide into the chassis. Now you've got to set the width of the ride height for the body you're using, in this case the C8. And on the C8, I used another 2mm spacer to set the width and get it correct. Once we've got this, slide everything together and the front end's ready to go. I've used the nail polish trick on the front tires to make them slicker and develop less traction. Once you've got the car assembled, go ahead and route the lead wires. NSR makes it very easy to do because they've already got pre-installed guides for the lead wire, and I just tack them in with a little bit of silicone adhesive, or nail polish works fine for that too. Now that the build was done, it was time to paint the body, since this was a white kit. I used a very easy to do Marlboro type livery in bright red and white, and I think it came out pretty good. It's easy to see on the track, and it definitely stands out. After a quick shakedown at Ted Essie's High Sierra Speedway, where the car ran right on the track record, it was off to Silicon City Speedway for a race last Saturday. Silicon City is the tightest track on our schedule, so it'll be interesting to see how it did on such a small track. And in a field of 12 GT3 cars, including other Corvette C8s, in its debut, it was on the top step of the podium and set a new lap record. The next day, at Fast Track Hobbies, it was the largest track on our schedule. And fresh off a victory at Silicon Speedway, the Corvette faced off against 9 other competitors, and it was back-to-back victories for the Corvette C8. The new C8 not only won the race, but it set a new track record of 7.34 seconds, which is the overall lap record at Fast Track Hobbies. This car turned out so good, I decided to build another car, so I'll have 2 C8s. Here's a preview of the new car. It's painted in Tamiya fluorescent orange, and I think it looks great, and boy is it easy to see on the track. I hope it runs as good as it looks. Thanks everybody for watching this build of the Corvette C8s. This is Jim Rose with NorCal Slot Car Scene.